right, everybody, welcome to today's webinar. We are live. We're going to be talking about all things forecasting. You've got myself, Gabe Larsen. While we allow just a couple other people to trickle on in here, we're going to play a quick video and then get right into the topic at hand.
My name is Tyson Gerhold. I'm with Pure Storage, and I'm the Global Director of Sales Operations. We use the HD Forecast and Inside Sales core platforms, and we've been using them for about 4 years now. The predictive analytics aspect of HD Forecast is something that's become a daily tool that our sales management relies upon to understand where their forecast is looking to shaping up, and to also spot productivity issues in the field. Since we've implemented HD Forecast, we've seen our forecast accuracy increase in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% based on geos. And this is driven primarily by the fact that our sales managers now have point-in-time comparisons to last week, last quarter, and last year for each of their sales reps, and then further up the chain to each of their sales districts to understand how people are trending on pipeline growth, bookings to plan, and overall performance on net new logos. Before we implemented HD Forecast, an analyst...
I want to make this interactive, so please put your name and where you're coming from, just so I can know who we've got, and so I know that you know how to use the chat box. While I do that, I will briefly introduce myself, and then we can get going here. Again, I run what we call Inside Sales Labs. That is our research and best practice here at InsideSales.com. You can find me on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and I will be offended if you do not add me on LinkedIn after this. I'll know that that's a sign of badness. So we got Cindy coming from Milne. We got Shelly from your company, Jim, Samantha, Heidi, Christopher, Bill, Tim, Mary, Peter. Fantastic, you guys. Looks like you know the chat box. Again, feel free to jump right in and ask whatever you want, all things forecasting and pipeline management. Let's jump right in. In fact, we've got a question. We've already got a good question from Mary. And normally I don't start with questions, but she just said it. She said, hey, Gabe, can you just give us the punchline right now rather than running through the whole presentation? So, Mary, yeah, I'll give it to you. She says, well, what's the punchline or most important thing people need to do in order to do forecasting well? Mary, you put me on the spot, but I would say pig-headed discipline. You have got to think about your process, your people, your systems with tenacity to actually follow through on it. I think one of the biggest problems is people do not follow through and they don't play tough when it comes to forecasting. So I would use the word pig-headed discipline. If you need to jump off now, maybe you can. So with that, again, keep the questions coming. Thanks, Mary, for the funny one to start. So I don't know if you've seen this guy. Who is this guy again? Is his name Don Julian, or is that? I don't know. He's the most famous man in the world. You got the meme here. I don't always commit my deals, but when I do, they are 87% accurate. That's not actually true. Most research out there says that when it comes to forecasting, we're sitting more in that 40% range, typically under 50, which, guys, that basically means most of us are sitting in the area of flipping a coin when it comes to our forecast strategies. If you want to get more up to that 90%, Serious Decisions says that only 21% of companies are in that kind of most most popular man in the world range of about 90%. The question is why? Why is forecasting so dang difficult? I think there's a couple reasons for it. One is this right here. And I'll see if I can highlight it briefly. On the right-hand side, you see you've got a Leatherman knife. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you've got a chef's knife. The problem is a lot of people try to do forecasting inherently in CRMs. And this is a multi-tool framework that goes about this deep in 150 areas. So they lack a lot of the things they want to do around forecasting. They lack the system and the capability, so that they end up maybe doing a lot on the side and it gets a little bit messy. Forecasting tools, specific forecasting tools, are more like a chef's knife. They're designed for a specific tool, and they're going to do one thing 150 feet deep. So this is one thing I find often is certainly a problem. The second thing, truthfully, great picture here. Why is forecasting so dang difficult? It just is. It is tough. You've got multiple things you've got to be thinking about. What do you do your forecasts with? Do you do it on, quarterly opportunities? Do you do products? Do you do products with schedules? Do you do revenue? How do you split opportunities? How does custom fields fit into that around margin and expected amount? You've got different dimensions. So you've got territories, you've got sales reps, you've got time. You're going to have periods. Are we doing weekly, quarterly, monthly? Judgments, who's calling what? Different sources. So you got your current pipeline, your history of your pipeline. The cadence, and I want to get into cadence today. How do we think about when we lock it? Are we doing a schedule, a roll-up schedule? How are we coming up with our forecast categories? Are we using forecast categories? Are we using set probabilities? How do users actually adopt it? Do we have something that users can adopt? Are we in multiple different systems? So, you guys, it is a headache. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of people have problems with it. Now, we've got a question from Tim here about quota and forecasting. And Tim, I should have included probably more about quota and forecasting. And he's brought up, is that a pain that a lot of people have trying to figure out how to work quota with forecasting? If you don't have your quota set, Tim, then forecasting becomes pretty difficult because we don't know the numbers that we're really trying to achieve or that we're really trying to hit. So establishing that quota, and that's truthfully probably a whole conversation in of itself, really being able to determine and optimize your quota so that your forecast can align. But that would be a key step in getting your forecast right, is having those quotas nailed down. Thanks, Tim, for the comment. So let's get into it. So how do you not be blindsided? I love this picture. You got a quarterback here. He's got his he's got the blindfold on. Someone's going to hit him, and I think we felt like this, right? It becomes the end of the month, or it's the end of the quarter, and we're just thinking, oh my goodness, how are we going to hit that number? We've not managed effectively our pipeline and our forecast, so we end up being quote-unquote blindsided. So there's a few principles, always more to talk about, but I wanted to dive into a couple of key areas, 6 of them to be exact in our time. So defining sales stages, determining stage probability, getting some of those forecast categories potentially working, the idea of using predictive forecasting, some thoughts around the cadence structure. How do I run a forecast cadence, and maybe a sample for you, and then some different things you may want to be measuring when it comes to pipeline management and forecast accuracy. Again, keep the questions coming, but let's go in and start with the first one. And Tim just wrote back and said, talked about quota. Again, quota probably should be number 0 on here, Tim, is you've got to figure out your quota so that you can make sure you can really start aligning your forecast to that. Thanks for the helpful hint. Good. Defining different sales stages. Here's a couple thoughts on sales stages that you might want to consider. 4 points here. One is, what type of model are you running? Are you running a transactional or relational? That's going to affect the way you build your sales stages. Creating descriptions, milestones, and outcomes. Too often, I've seen organizations, I've worked with organizations, they think they can just come up with the sales stage, and truthfully, that's not enough. You've got to get deeper into that process, and I think some of these things around descriptions, milestones, and outcomes will be interesting for you. Next is ensuring sales stages cover the entire customer journey. You want to make sure you think of top of funnel from a sales perspective to that bottom of funnel. What does the customer go through? What are the key steps they go through that we need to go with them to get them from that suspect, prospect, to customer to client? And then lastly, very often we see that this happens, and this is this concept of duplication, where you've got sales stages that sales reps have that are they're pretty similar. They're similar enough that we get into a bind. It gets a little bit confusing. So the more you can keep them distinct, the better you're going to be as you kind of notate and diagram this. So I want to touch on two of them a little bit more, this transactional versus relational idea, and this idea around milestones and outcomes. So this is a debate, and actually I got a good question here. Let me see if I can open it again. It looks like it came from, who was it? Mike. Mike asked this question just a couple minutes ago, but he said, can I have both a transactional and relational sales stages in my instance, or should I just have one? I was hoping I wouldn't be asked that, as I do think this is problematic. For a long time, you guys, I believe that you should standardize on one. But I'm finding more and more, and I don't know if you feel like there's some research or best practice on this, let me know. I'm purely speaking from experience here, Mike, so take that food for thought. But here's the idea. A lot of companies are obviously wanting to move upstream. They want bigger deals. We all want bigger deals. The problem with moving upstream is it is going to be a relational model. It'll be bigger deal sizes, longer sales cycles. In it, whether you like it or not, is probably going to be a different business model than your high velocity or your kind of small business model. Now, companies who try to treat them the same, I feel like they're failing more often. Better companies are recognizing that they are very different, and they have a completely different go-to-market strategy for their transactional business, a different marketing go-to-market, a different sales plays. Obviously the sales cycle, the deal sizes are different, the talk track's going to be different, and then the relational kind of has its own world. So I've seen in more companies that I feel like have been successful really separate those two businesses and say, hey, look, if you're running a transactional business, you are going to be almost a different entity. You're going to run a different motion. If you're running that big picture, high-end, high-touch, long sales cycle, then you're probably looking at a different motion and therefore different processes. So here's two examples, and you'll notice the two just fit the idea. The transactional feels very step, close, whereas that relational leaves room for some real strategy, planning, making sure you get executive buy-in, solution development rather than just kind of a presentation. We got to develop a solution rather than just give a demo. A lot of transactional models, it's just, I do my needs, I do a demonstration, and then I basically try to close it. So, to get back to Mike, I'm open to both of them. I used to be a little bit against it, and I think there's good reason for it. But I think knowing whether you're transactional or relational and building your sales stages as such, again, that map that customer journey, is going to be extremely helpful in kind of operating this efficiently. The next piece is this idea around again, milestones and descriptions and outcomes. And yeah, that's a little bit small. I'm going to see if I can blow it up on mine just so we can go through it a little bit more. But nothing too fancy here, but I would absolutely recommend that you take the time to build a document like this. Now, we built this in partnership with HubSpot, and I'm looking at some of my colleagues here, and it's purely just a sample. You can download it at InsideSales.com resources, and this will actually show you the sales stages are more relational or more strategic in nature, but each stage then has a description, and that description is just, what is this? What's going on in this stage? But I really like the outcomes and the milestones. So the milestones are, how do I move from one stage to the other? I need to know what the check boxes are. I'm a check guy, right? I like to check different things on kind of my time management. So in order to move from stage 1 to stage 2, what do I need to actually do? And then what is the outcome at the end of that stage that I'm actually trying to achieve? A lot of people actually take this to the next level and build some of these concepts into CRM to help people really be able to manage this more effectively. I'm a big proponent of systematizing it, but I think the first step is really getting it down on paper in a way that allows people to start to really know what these different sales stages are. Good. Okay, step 2 here. Now that we got our stages in place, we want to start thinking about this concept of probability. So again, a stage is basically the tactical thing that I'm going to be doing as I move one step to the other through the sales process. Probability is going to be my likelihood that I can actually close something or move something into that closed state as we think about our sales stages. So a couple different ways you can think about getting a probability into your system. Number one, you just shoot from the hip, right? Have a rep or a sales operations person just default it whenever they want. This is a little more of a cowboy town approach. Probably wouldn't recommend that. And again, just so you're kind of on the same page, when I'm saying probabilities, you can see it here. Again, each stage has some sort of a number associated with it in order to determine how likely that deal is going to be brought to kind of close. So again, number one, you go subjective and you just say, hey, sales ops or somebody kind of just throw out numbers and will allow you to do that. The next level is to just go with the default probability by stage, and I'd say this is most typical. This is, people will go Google it. I think even a couple of the CRMs have it built in like a standard. Stage 1 is 10%, stage 2 is 25%. And that's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea if you don't leave it at that. I mean, you really want to get to that third bullet where you're starting to actually run some reports to be able to determine what the probability actually is by stage. And I had a good example here from Insight Squared. Let me see if I can pull this up to give you a quick example. This is not that hard to do if you want to go with this model. And again, we'll talk about some of the pros and cons here in just a second. But you see here, again, Insight Squared, it's just a pipeline report that more or less talks about at each stage what is the likelihood of close. And they're using real data here, so you don't actually have to use some kind of fake or some kind of standard. So if you can start tracking this more effectively, then you can add in this into your probabilities, and you're going to have that kind of a lot tighter model when it comes to probabilities tightly wrapped around your stages. Now, let's get into then, okay, so if I've got my stages and I've gone ahead and put in some sort of probability in here, what does the forecast look like? I love this, again, a simple example from Insight Squared. So what basically you're doing in this model, you guys, is you're saying, I've got 3 opportunities, just as a sample. One's in demo, one's in trial, one's in negotiation. And notice that probability, right, is 25, 50, and 90. And then you've got an actual amount of the opportunity there. On opportunity 1, it's 100. And then you basically have that weighted probability attached to it as your forecast amount. These all roll up into the $395 total forecasted amount. This method is easily understood. And truthfully, if you, depending on how you use your probabilities, it's pretty objective because it's not allowing any subjectivity into it. There's no management calls. This simply goes off stage and probability. So a lot of the emotion is taken out of it. Now, some of the cons of this method are, well, the probabilities I talked about most often are subjectively chosen, again, assigned to these different stages, and they're rarely do people move to that third step where you actually have rigorously tested probabilities. Now, a couple other things that you probably want to take into consideration on this is you're going to miss some stuff. So one example that often gets missed in this idea is like sales cycle length. It's not taken into account as well. So for example, if an opportunity is, say, I don't know, 2 years old, but you have the close date set to this month, it's going to be counted as the same as a typical opportunity that's only a couple weeks old, but is also due to close fairly soon. So these types of ideas can kind of mess things up because you put it so stringent on the way that you're actually using these stages and these probabilities. Good. So that's one option. I got a couple questions here. Let me see if I can answer them. I need to go back potentially a couple slides to this one. It looks like we've got, Tom, I'm going to see if I can answer your question. So on this slide, you guys, Tom brought up these probabilities at 10, 25, 40, 60, 75. And again, he said, are these things that I can just use with my own process or with my own stages? Again, going back, I'd say you want to be thinking about your stages probably deeper than that. Don't just mimic it. Probably a rule of thumb, Tom, is that you can do this. You could say, look, you normally can just go ahead and steal Google and probably steal somebody else's sales stages. I'd probably go to like an 80-20 at least, though, and say, take 80% of it, but at least make 20% of it customized to your world, your motion, etc. I'd love you to go through the whole process, but if you don't, I'd say at least go there. And then again, using just standard probabilities by stage, I think you'd have a couple different options there. I wouldn't just go with the standard. I'd try to do a little bit of analysis to get those a little bit tighter. Thanks for the question, Tom. Let me know if that made sense. So let's go into the second idea here, and this is going to be building forecast categories. Now, these are usually things that they're two different options here. These are going to be things you probably wouldn't do together as part of a forecast strategy. So take this as an option here. So what you're seeing here is, again, it's basically a sales pipeline, and I've got a couple different things happening here. I've got my stages, I've got some probability built in there, but then I've added basically something, and I'm just trying to make it a little bigger. These are these forecast categories, and notice that they're more or less assigned by stage here. Now, different organizations do this differently. You can just go completely subjective here and allow forecast categories to be defined by sales managers, sales reps, etc. A lot of organizations will actually bucket them into these different sales stages. And again, on forecast categories, there is some standardization, but you're going to see different verbiage: pipeline, commit, upside, expect. Those are your more typical ones. Some don't use them all. So the idea is probably more important than the verbiage, but my goodness, boy, is it important. And actually, this is good to bring up now, because who had the question? It was Philip. It looks like it was Philip here. He said, what are some of the keys of making a good forecast? And I say, hey, one of the things you've got to get is this standardized language where you're all talking about the same things. If you don't, I think you're really going to confuse people as you ask them to do things. So forecast categories, great way to think about it here. You can see the organization. This is actually a real example. What they've done is they've got pipeline, upside, commit, and won. Pipeline is basically associated with identified and proposal stage. You can see the planning stage doesn't have anything in it. And then you've got upside is basically their finalist, commit is their selected, and then closed is closed. What this allows you to do is kind of interesting, but I want to make sure you're clear on these category breakdown. And again, these are some samples. You can go and find some others depending on the language you like. Some managers like different things, but pipeline, best case, commit, and I've put a slight definition there. So again, pipeline, brand new stuff that's not likely to close this quarter. Best case is going to be stuff that may close if everything goes as planned, and then those commit are going to be those opportunities that have that stake the claim these are going to close, and then obviously close has been closed. So you get a little bit of vocabulary, a little bit of language around these types of forecast categories. Now, the way you'd actually implement this in a sample forecast structure, and see if you can stick with me and follow this, you say, okay, I've got my reps, and again, a little small for me, so I'm going to go here just for a second. But I've got my reps, and each one of them, and I'm just going to use commit. Normally, people would roll up, the two categories, both best case and commit. But for simplification, just go with me for a minute. So my reps are committing a certain number. And the way they're doing that in this instance is it's going to be basically exactly pulled from the sales stages. So that commit is more like taking from 1 or 2 stages. So they go ahead and put their commits in based on the sales stage as decided. We then have a roll up to a manager that says, okay, in this team it's going to be 1,200, and in the second team it's going to be 2,000. Now, a lot of times, this is where the manager judgment comes into play. The manager can then override that commit and actually put in a different number. And you see I've put that here on the person on the left. I've said, okay, although the commit was 1,200, I'm gonna put that down to 900. And on the right-hand side, although the commit was 2,000, we went ahead and put that down to 900. You leave that subjectivity so you're not so stringent. And this solves some of the problems that stringent approach potentially on just using probability has that we talked about previously. That then rolls up to a VP or a director, and you can continue to roll this up as necessary. So the total commit here is going to be $2,900, and then the manager again has the opportunity to subjectively override that number. So you get this objective and subjective approach that allows you to use the sales stages in these forecast categories, but also allows managers to add in some judgment to be able to do some things that they feel like are necessary to keep in line with the quota or the number or the targets they're basically hitting. Good. Next one. Let's dive into this predictive forecast concept here. So I've got probabilities, I got forecast categories, and then I've got this idea of using a predictive forecast. A lot of people say, what is the idea of predictive forecasting? I mean, basically the idea, to put it in layman terms, is it's trying to take some of this subjectivity out, although you always, I think, want some of that in there. But it's going to look at historical conversion rates. What's winning percentage of similar opportunities that have been like this in the past? It's going to look at current sales pipeline. It's going to look at number of opportunities in a time frame. It's going to factor in other variables, average deal size, time, engagement, the number of times something has been shifted. All of this data-driven sales forecast rolls up into this predictive forecast that substantially is going to make your sales forecast a lot tighter than the intuition of reps. Now, there's probably a more fancy term to throw on that, but let's leave that at the moment and dive into some of the things that you may actually see. So you have to actually get a tool to do predictive forecasting. You don't have BI tools do not do predictive forecasting. They do great reporting around pipeline and forecast management. Predictive forecast tools such as InsideSales.com HD forecast tool does a lot of those things I talked to you about to see if you can't actually get to a number that's more accurate than intuition. So let's just walk through briefly how this may look, and then I'll give you an example as I have on the others. So as normal, whether you're using forecast categories or you're using probability assigned to stages, you have some sort of commit. You're going to have some sort of upside. Now, in this case, I'm using the forecast categories, and these are things pulled directly from, again, your system into a predictive forecasting tool. One of the things that's going to be potentially nice added on that is what is actually at commit risk. And what is commit risk is exactly that. It's stuff that's maybe shifted close dates 3 or 4 times, and I know the sales rep is saying that it's going to commit, but it's probably not that likely to close. So taking that and some of those other factors into consideration, it's going to actually give you that forecasted number based on multiple variables rather than just the forecast categories, which is more or less going to be some data, potentially with subjective assignment of reps. So that predictive forecast gets you a more true number, and it then becomes very effective at helping reps really get tighter to their number. So let me give you an example of how this may come into play. So as you think about using manual versus predictive forecasting, here are some of the things that I think are pretty helpful as you think through it. So one is understanding pipeline changes. Obviously, if we're doing that manual, that's going to be, well, a lot of hours just checking people, trying to do spreadsheets. In predictive, it's going to be one click and you're going to see what exactly happened from this week to last week when we actually locked it. I talked about a little bit of risk before. If you're doing it manually, you're always trying to get in the face of reps and say, hey, what's going on? How can we get this? And you're trying to kind of peel back those layers. In a predictive system, it's going to flag a lot of that. Next one, focus on deals you can win. A lot of times, if you're doing it manual, it is just going to be subjective judgment of sales reps based on manual analytics and CRM. If you go into this predictive world, you're looking at scores based on a lot of different factors to determine which deals are most likely to come in this month or this quarter. And then lastly, I think a great one is this roll up on accurate forecast. We've just been talking about rolling this up and some of this subjectivity, and I want to show you this. I kind of see if we can't visualize what it might look like. But you're getting is every time. I mean, I love the subjective idea of manager judgment. I think it's extremely important. But as you roll that up and you keep doing subjective manager judgment, you can just really get off course on your forecast numbers. And so having this predictive line set can really tighten it so that judgment calls become a little bit more effective, or potentially a lot more effective in your forecast strategy. So here's what it might look like, again, using some of the samples we have before. Similar motion here in the sense that sales reps still have some sort of expectation to submit, but they've got a nice system to do it. So they're going to submit their forecast, again, using potentially these forecast categories. And it rolls up to the manager, and you've got this committed amount. Now you then have this predictive amount that says, I know that we're committing 1,200, but actually that number is more likely 900 on the right-hand side. It's a little bit less. But then the manager still has the ability to look at that predictive number and make a call on it before it gets locked in for the week or for the month or whatever your cadence is on. And that strategy is going to roll up to other leaders in the organization. So I'm a believer in using the art and science. I wouldn't always just go with this or that. I would say let's use the tools we have as well as what the sales rep's intuition. I mean, that's sometimes what we hire them for, and see if we can't come closer than ever on our best judgment on what the forecast should or should not be. Good. So let's move into these last couple things. Let's see. So I want to see if we can just ask a quick question. Now that we've wrapped up a couple of these different, if you can, in the Q&A box, what is the method that you use? Do you use a predictive forecast strategy? Are you using just sales stage with the probability? Or are you using a lot of forecast stages? So Heidi, while we're doing that, please throw in some of those things. Heidi asked a question, is predictive closely tied to steps that need to happen in stage optimization? So predictive is going to absolutely, and Heidi may need to ask a follow-up here if I answer it wrong, but is predictive tied to steps that need to happen in stage? So predictive is going to see, we have sales stages identified, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How effectively are people moving through those? We're going to see if people are actually taking too long, or, you know, if I'm supposed to go from stage 1 to stage 2, typically in 30 days, and all of a sudden I'm going 60 days here, it's flagging it, right? So it's flagging a lot of the things that should be normal as I move through those sales stages so that you don't have to then bombard reps to try to figure that out yourself. So the answer to that should be yes. Now, it looks like most people, what methodology are you using here? A lot of people are saying they've been using that middle one. A lot of people saying they're using forecast categories to kind of manage their forecast at the moment. Let me ask a follow-up to you guys. What are the forecast categories that you are using? Again, I showed a couple, but I'd love to kind of get your opinion on what you found to be effective in the language you're using to kind of coach your reps, coach your team. Let's see, Martin asked a question in the middle of this. Executive sponsorship, is that within the client org? Martin, maybe you could follow up on that, because normally executive sponsorship is something that would come out, unless you're actually capturing that within your system, which most people do not. That's going to come out in your cadence strategy. One of the key questions that we recommend asking as part of your actual forecast meeting: does this deal have executive sponsorship? But that wouldn't come out before that process. Now, that's not to say it couldn't. A lot of the stuff we've found, the more information you can feed into a predictive forecast, the better, you guys. So one of the things I found the other day to be interesting, configure, price, quote type of information from a company like Aptus. Whew, that can be a very effective data point into a predictive forecast. What is the actual pricing, discounting we're doing? That can be a nice input in to determine if something is likely to close or not. Rick, question here. Would this be effective for a company that sells engineered projects where reps are involved in only about 40 opportunities a year? When you say, would this be effective, Rick, which part of this are you asking? I mean, 40 opportunities a year is, assuming they're large deals. I'm going to assume they're large deals because that's not a lot of opportunities to be closing. Maybe it's not huge. Maybe you're a mid tier 40. You do okay X a month. That's potentially not terrible. So anytime your guys, Rick, are going through a formal process to close a deal, whether it's with them or with partners, they got to have something. And again, I'd push you to a transactional or relational model, and then we talk about how to throw on categories or probabilities or predictive forecasting. But if you don't have something like this, then what would you potentially do? So I'd say no matter what, if you're closing opportunities, you want to have something in place. But if you're talking about, hey, for these 40 opportunities, should we go as deep as predictive forecasting and get into a lot of this mumbo-jumbo stuff you're talking about? It depends on the size of the opportunities, right? So if those opportunities, 40 a year, are extremely important and there's a 2-year sales cycle and we need to know what's going on with them, heck yeah. I'd say predictive forecasting is best utilized when you have larger complex deal sizes than super duper transactional, one call closes. Let me know, Rick, if I got to that or if I was wrong on it. Heidi, great because it provides structure and discipline for forecasting. Yeah, I do think you're right on that. I mean, it comes back to if you have that in place and you're using it, then you're going to have the structure that's necessary to win. Great. Love the questions, everybody. Keep them coming. Just to kind of, man, I wish we would have done a poll question on this. This is interesting. It looks like the things that were most utilized, well, I don't know if there's most utilized forecast categories. It looks like we've got a little bit of everything here. We've got commit. We definitely have commit. A lot of people use expect, upside, pipeline. Again, keep them coming in. I mean, it looks like it's kind of all across the board, but those would be the ones I'm hearing probably the most from Tom, Peter, James. Yeah, interesting. I'd be interested, how many of you have actually dove into and tried a predictive forecasting solution, whether that's InsideSales.com or someone else? I'd be interested if you want to throw that in and your experiences with it. I'm going to jump on. Let's jump on. A couple other things coming in, but I'll get to those in just a second. So let's talk about cadence. So cadence, you guys. So I've got this system. I've got my stages. I've got my probability set up. I've got to figure out a way then to manage this. And this was that pig-headed discipline I was talking about when we started. I don't know if you've ever read this book, Flawless Execution. This gentleman by the name of James D. Murphy, he goes by Murph. They're ex-American fighter pilots who do corporate sales training. Love the book, love what they do. The idea behind it is basically Americans actually sell their fighter pilot jets all over the world. But when it comes to execution and domination, the American fighter pilots typically outperform others, yet they have the same tools. And so their training goes around a lot of the strategy and methodologies that the American fighter pilots use to become the best, and they call it flawless execution. One of the key concepts in flawless execution is this idea of briefing or debriefing. And I'll spare you if you don't want to read the book. They basically say before every mission, the American fighter pilots, they get in a room and they actually rip off their badge because they're more interested in truth rather than politics, or truth rather than anything else. So it's not about you being higher ranked than me. It's about let's get to truth. So they rip off their badges, they put it on the table, and then they have a brief before the mission. They then go and do their mission, and then they come back in a room, same idea, rip off their badge, put it on the table, and have another discussion about a debrief, what happened, and they're, again, going to be in each other's face because they're looking, we're talking about millions of dollar jets that they're flying, we're talking about people's lives, so it doesn't matter who has politics, what matters is truth, not rank. So this idea, you guys, is killer. It's a killer concept when it comes to forecasting, because you've got to get in a discipline of really talking, finding a way to talk frequently and get that pig-headed discipline so that you can have a forecast strategy that works effectively. Now, I've put in just a quick sample here for you. You can mix and match this yourself, but I like typically doing it weekly. I think a weekly forecast, doesn't matter your deal size, is going to be pretty important. So I've put here, Thursday morning, sales reps basically own that. They're going to go ahead and submit their pipeline. Then you're going to have Thursday afternoon, sales managers review it. They're potentially going to add in the manager judgment there. Then Friday morning, a VP goes in. He does his manager forecast meeting and go ahead and apply his or her judgment. And then we basically do, at the end of Friday, an executive briefing. We lock it in for the week and then move on as necessary. So some sort of version of a cadence is going to be extremely important, that you do it and you stick to it. Now, as you run these meetings, a couple thoughts that you might want to be considering. The best people do not let their salespeople just go through this motion easily. I don't say you want to beat them to death, but you've got to ask tough questions. So we've put a couple questions that we've found to be effective in these forecast meetings down so you can think about it, but you're typically going to get your kind of interview questions or coaching questions from that model. And that is ANUM, A-N-U-M. That's authority, need, urgency, and money. Some of these best questions then are going to say, hey, what is, do they actually have a compelling event? Are we working with the decision maker? When was the last interaction with the client? What is the next step? What can I do to help? What could get in the way of this deal closing? So you want to have those tough questions that you ask in order to make sure you put those reps on the hot seat to do it most effectively. Now, I want to ask, what are some of the questions that you guys ask or you found to be effective in your forecasting meetings to make sure the reps don't get away with pushing deals, happy years, etc.? I'd love to hear some of those as we continue on here. The second thing in those forecast meetings, you guys, that I think becomes extremely important is this idea of just taking notes. So I put a sample down here. We call this a rolling agenda, and we use it in a lot of our meetings to say, what happened today? What were some of the successes? What are we discussing, and what are the action items? And sales leaders got to live by something like this. They got to take down great notes so that next week when we go through this and we review what's going on, we can't let, you don't want sales reps to think you're going to bring it up once and never bring it up again. And so being that pig-headed discipline specifically around note-taking, I think could be extremely, extremely effective. So let's see if we can grab just a couple other points here, and then I'm going to come back to these in just a second. Thinking about measurement, you want to get a solid baseline. What actual things do we want to be measuring effectively for our process? Now I'm going to just go back. We got maybe 10 people here who put some of their questions. I'll just put a couple of them down here. So Mike said one of his great questions is, what can marketing do? We've got, it was Beth here who said, do we actually have the decision maker? We got Tim who said, it looks like, Tim said, is there anybody involved in the deal who can say no at this point? I like that one, Tim. Let's see, a question maybe here from Christopher. Forecast categories, how closely related are FCs to time when a deal is closing? I've seen companies create FCs, that's forecast category, based on time, i.e. days to close, 60, 90 days out. And another company create FCs based on sales stage, demo done, proposal, which is regardless of time. What do you recommend? That is a great question, because we actually had a couple people, and I didn't highlight it, I didn't want to go too deep into it, but a lot of people actually said, when I said, what forecast categories do you use, they actually put down time frames around it. My preference is to use forecast categories around stages rather than around time frames. I believe time frames are built in either subjectively by the rep, again, in what we're closing. So how much do you think so I've got an opportunity, it's in stage 4. Stage 4 inherently has either a time frame associated with. When I say commit, it's basically committed for this period. That way you don't actually have to put categories associated with it. But I also have seen reps use some subjective nature to determine that time frame. So I do like to try to either build in the time frame into the stage or into the forecast categories, and stick the forecast categories more associated with the sales stages. Do you suggest meeting with reps in groups or individually to discuss? So when you run this, and this is a question from Rick, when you run a forecast cadence, I do believe you should do both. If you're having your weekly one-on-one with sales reps, you would talk about this as part of it. I do believe as part of your weekly team meeting, you would have a forecast portion of it and talk about what the team is basically committing, because you want to be transparent about the team, about how close you are about hitting your team goals. And then again, if you're a VP, I do that same thing with managers, right? If you do your weekly one-on-ones, you have an idea, but you have a team meeting to see how well you're rolling up the entire function or the entire group together. Denise, who are the influencers that can impact the decision-making process? So that's another. Thank you, Denise. That's another question you'd potentially ask in some of your forecast meeting. Great points, you guys. Appreciate the interaction there. Good. Let's continue on. So we're getting to the bottom here on time. So I might just cover. This, and then we can potentially go into a couple other points here with Q&A. So when you're thinking about different things to measure around forecast and pipeline management, I like these. I like quality, quantity, velocity, and balance. And you'll see those kind of on the outside. And then I really like change, coverage, and risk. I feel like those, what is that, 7 there? That's going to give you a nice, robust, quote-unquote, forecast and pipeline management measurement structure as you think about really tightening this down. Let me just give a couple examples here so that you can kind of get that idea. So velocity is how fast deals are moving through the process. In fact, let me just cover them kind of briefly here. So velocity, how fast they're moving. And balance is you get a lot of reps who get too much at the end, and they don't get enough at the beginning. They work their pipe and then close it and then work. You want to try to keep that balance as you move through it. Quantity and quality. So quantity, do I just have enough pipeline to meet my quota? I mean, a lot of people talk about having a 3x or 4x, quote unquote pipeline number so that you can actually hit the number that you want. That's where kind of that quality and quantity come into play, so that I know if am I going to potentially hit my number or not. Then change, coverage, and risk. Probably a little bit self-explanatory, but I'm a big believer in what's changing, how things are moving forward, how things are moving backwards. Coverage, again, gets a little deeper into that idea. Do I have the coverage of the pipe I need to hit my number? And then risk, where are we seeing some of those weak spots? Where are we seeing areas that I may run into problems and I may not actually be able to hit those numbers, those commit numbers that I've talked about. So if you want to dive deeper into measurements, feel free to reach out to me. I want to get into just a couple questions here at the end to see if we can effectively kind of wrap this up. And then I'll point you to a couple of these items here. So one is, again, I'll be offended if you don't grab me on LinkedIn. Would love to continue the dialogue around pipeline management and forecasting. We've got some great, we've got an ebook you can grab here in the resource section. If you go to InsideSales.com resources, they can get some sales stages, just some samples, descriptions, milestones, etc. And then I think it'd be a shame if you kind of went through this and you didn't hear just a little bit about, I want to get to this briefly, the HD forecast product. If you're thinking about predictive forecasting, really taking that to the next level, and again, this is not about replacing humans. This is about finding a way to mix technology and objectivity and subjectivity. So let me go to a couple questions. Heidi, thank you. She said she'd connect with me on LinkedIn. Looks like we got a couple people dropping here. Yeah, I mean, we got some questions about man versus machine. What is, Gabe, kind of this is from Daniel, Chris, and Jamie, all kind of saying, how do we balance that man versus machine? Guys, this is always going to be a problem in the sales acceleration space. You don't want to go too far one way. You don't want to go too far the other way. I would say you don't want to just buy a tool and call it for all sorts. That's why manager judgment becomes effective in a forecast strategy. So I would always try to find the balance of using machine and man. So Tim is asking, hey, what about following up with this presentation? We will potentially send this presentation out. We'll have to see. I'll look to marketing here, Tim. When it comes to, so Mary asked about this cadence concept. How often should you do it? Should you really do it every week? Should you run this once a month, every quarter? I mentioned, I think previously, guys, I like the idea of doing it each week. I think it's a little fanatical. It's a little bit intense. But I think doing that can really, it just keeps you honest. It keeps you on your toes. And whether you're doing small deals or big deals, I think you can bring those together in a weekly forecast kind of strategy that we talked about before. Okay, looks like that's basically it, everybody. Really appreciate it. Appreciate the questions. Again, I'll be offended if you don't keep the conversation going on LinkedIn or grab me on Twitter. And with that, we'll let you go and say have a fantastic